Good morning, everyone. I'm Victoria Brown from the Scottish Council on Archives, and we're really pleased to welcome you to the first of a series of webinars on various topics related to copyright. And we're really pleased to be working with Dr. Ellie Pridgeon, a consultant archivist, on this webinar series. And we just had a few things to mention before I pass you on to Ellie, and she can tell you a bit more about herself and what she's going to cover in today's session. As you'll have gathered, today's very much an introductory session, and the purpose of it is that we really want to gather a bit more feedback from all of you about what you'd like to see in future sessions. So we're going to start out with a Mentimeter poll, and some of you might be familiar with this, but if not, it's quite a simple poll, and it's usually most easy to use it on a phone or some sort of other device like a tablet. You'll see that I popped in the chat box the website, and that's where you can access the poll when you input the code. And I'll pop that up shortly, and hopefully everyone will be able to interact with that without any trouble. But just pop any questions in the chat box if you have any issues. And then, yeah, just to mention another bit of housekeeping. At the end of the session, we'll ask you to pop any questions in the chat box. You can pop questions in throughout as well if they occur to you. And Ellie will do her best to answer these near the end. But given the subject matter, it's not always possible to give an immediate answer. So there will be follow-up, and Ellie's kindly offered to contact some of you direct if it's helpful as well. So without any further ado, I'll pass you on to Ellie, and thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed the next hour.
Thanks, Victoria. That's very useful and helpful. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So please shout out or wave if there are any issues on that front. So my name is Ellie Pridgeon, and I'm a consultant archivist. I work for all sorts of different organisations in very many different capacities. Throughout these training sessions over the next few months, I will be focusing on case studies, essentially, from organisations that I've worked with. We'll have a very short case study today as a start, as part of the introduction to copyright session. So I'm bringing my knowledge from working with a variety of different organisations, including museums, universities, community archives, digital archiving, archiving websites, archiving social media. So also the other thing that I'd like to point out, which follows on from what Victoria says, it's very difficult to actually develop these copyright sessions without some kind of knowledge of what you as audiences want. So we do have the poll, and also so it's very, very useful for us to know what you would like in future sessions. So in terms of this session today, this is very much an introduction to copyright. I'm absolutely aware that we have some very well-known archivists in the training session who will know a huge amount about copyright and have been working within the sector for 20, 30 years, etc. And I'm also aware that there are other individuals who are will really, this will be their first outing, if you like, into copyright. So what I'm trying to say is essentially what we're doing today is very much an introduction to copyright to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And after this session, we can pick particular areas that people are most interested in to focus on for the remainder of the sessions. So let me put up my first PowerPoint then. Okay. So That's great. Right, again, please shout out if you can't see this. I'm hoping that everybody can see my PowerPoint presentation. Now, as I said, this is very much an introduction to understanding copyright. Some points we will very much skip over, and I want to come and revisit those in future sessions. So I'll make that point very clearly when it's a kind of an issue or an area that we will revisit in the following months. So the first part then of the session today is essentially an introduction to copyright. The second part of the session is going to be me giving you a very quick case study, which is some work that I've done in recent years for the Imperial War Museum, where I was a lead consultant archivist on one of the projects there. So I want to finish off with that as a practical example, but I'd like to start off by just introducing the topic of copyright to everybody. Right, okay, so to start off with then, what is copyright? Well, copyright, of course, is part of intellectual property right, or IPR. IPR includes many things, including patents, trademarks, database rights, trade secrets, designs, performance rights, and also copyright itself. As you can see, I've highlighted this on the left-hand side. So you can see here that copyright very much sits under this umbrella of intellectual property right. You will come across in your collections database rights, trademarks, patents, perhaps, depending on the nature of your collection, designs, and even performers' rights will be relevant to you. But what we're focusing on today is very much copyright, which is just a very small part of this IPR. Right, so now I realise that some of my slides do have quite a lot of text on them, but obviously we can circulate these and it's being recorded. So I will pick and choose some key elements of some of these slides to talk about. So just a quick overview of copyright law. So the first copyright law in the world was the Statute of Anne. This dates from 1710. In the 19th century, in 1886, we have the Berne Convention. This was the first international copyright agreement, which allowed for creators or authors to automatically receive copyright protection. I'll talk a little bit more about the Berne Convention, perhaps in other sessions. UK copyright law today is highly complex and it's constantly evolving. It is based on various legislation and regulations and revisions, including the 1911 and 56 Copyright Acts. The key act is the 1988 Copyright Designs and Patents Acts and the subsequent revisions. We also have a 2003 Copyright and Related Rights Regulations and also 2014 as well. And our law is also based on various EU directives, mostly transposed into UK law by means of statutory instruments, so essentially making these law. So, and 2019, we have the EU Copyright Directive with a focus on digital content. So, as you can see, this is a very, very complex area. I wouldn't expect everybody to know everything about all these acts. I'm just very much giving you an overview here, just to really get your head around the complex issues associated with copyright law. As I put at the bottom, ambiguous terminology as well that we find in copyright law, including the terms substantial, non-commercial, reasonable, simply means that it's not black and white. And this causes a lot of issues for the heritage sector, as we'll see as we go through. So What is copyright? Copyright is the legal right given to the creator or author of the work for a fixed number of years. Copyright is automatically assigned in the UK and does not require registering or use of a copyright symbol. Copyright only protects the material expression of an idea, not an idea itself. And to be copyrighted, the work must be original and show some level of skill. The copyright holder, therefore, has the right to reproduce, disseminate and publish the material. The copyright owner can be an organisation or an individual. When the owner dies, copyright transfers to an individual or an organisation. And when the copyright duration expires, the work falls into the public domain and may be freely used. Please be aware that copyright is separate from ownership of an item or object. So when you have material transferred by donors to your archive or heritage organisation, please be aware that ownership itself is actually separate from the copyright. So it's quite common for owners to transfer the ownership of their item, their painting, for instance, their collection of letters, but not to transfer the copyright. These are very much separate. And this is something which causes huge issues in the heritage and archive sector. So why does copyright matter then for your organisation? Well, it's likely that the material you have in your collection will be in copyright. It is also likely that you will not be the copyright owner for at least some of the material in your collection. So everybody working in your organisation has a legal and ethical obligation to respect the copyright of others, to know their own responsibilities and to realise the opportunities for using copyright, or getting around copyright, I should say. Now, just be aware that infringement or abuse of copyright law in the UK, now this infringement does include reproduction or selling of copyrighted works, including online, unauthorised film, sound, literary, dramatic works and musical work performances, also removing rights information. So, for example, a copyright credit line on perhaps on your website. And do be aware that infringement can result in criminal or civil proceedings, such as awarding of damages, taking down of copies, injunctions, preventing further use. So we do need to be very careful about how we manage copyright in our archives and in our heritage organisations. So who owns the copyright in a work? Well, usually it is the creator or the author of a work. So you think about the collections that you have in your heritage organisation. So, for example, if you have a letter, it's usually the author or creator of that letter who has the copyright, is the copyright holder. Now, there are many, many exceptions to this. And again, I'm not going to go into great detail about this at the moment. This is something that we can come back to in another session to look at in more detail, because this is just an introduction, of course. But the exceptions include work created by employees at work, where the organisation holds the copyright. So this means that usually in your organisation, employees creating material, letters, emails, etc., the organisation usually holds the copyright. This doesn't cover film or typographical works or broadcasts or sound recordings, but again, it's not important at the moment. We can come back and look at this in more detail going forwards. Photographs commissioned before the 1st of August 1989. The commissioner is the copyright holder for this material. Again, don't worry too much about these at the moment. It's something that we can come back and look at. And also works produced for the Crown in the UK, because this material will become Crown copyright, for example, maps. But generally what we need to, if we take one thing away from this, it's important to remember that it's the creator or author of a work who is usually the copyright holder in many cases. Now, again, there are 8 types of works that copyright in the UK protects. And again, I'm certain that these are types of material that you will have in your archive collections. Okay, so number 1 is literary works. So these include newspapers, emails, letters, poems, software. Again, don't worry too much about that at the moment. Books, journals, for instance. So we have to remember that these are protected by copyright. So that does limit what we can actually do with that material. The second type of work is a dramatic work for performance. So these include plays, performance art, operas, and ballets, for instance. The third type of work is the musical work. So, for example, songs, film soundtracks, musical scores, and sheet music. Number 4 is film recordings. So, for example, films and film clips, stills, cartoons as well. These are all protected by copyright in the UK. Also, sound recordings. So I'm sure that many of you will have oral history recordings in your collection. Recordings of literary, dramatic or musical works, recorded lectures, for instance, also sound effects. The 6th type of work is broadcasts for public dissemination for terrestrial, cable, satellite broadcast, and also this includes broadcasting via the web as well. Number 7 is artistic works, which include plans, paintings, photographs, sculptures, crafts, and also graphic works such as drawings, maps, charts, and graphs. And also number 8, which is slightly different in many respects, one that we often forget about, but this is a typographical arrangement. This is how a text is arranged on a page in a published literary, dramatic, or musical work. Now, the typographical arrangement can actually be in copyright, even if the work itself is out of copyright, and that often causes a lot of confusion in heritage organisations and archives. So essentially, archives and heritage organisations need to think about how they can actually manage within the letter of the law these 8 types of material which they have in their collections. Right, okay, so the next slide is about how long does copyright last? Well, again, this is an incredibly complex issue and not one I'm going to tackle today. We will need an entire session on that, or, you know, many weeks, in fact, to study it in detail. But very often it is the lifetime of the author of the work plus 70 years, starting after the year they died. So, for example, if the author died in 1950, the work comes out of copyright on the 1st of January 2021. I think that's right, yes. So, as I said, this is very complex, right, for many different types of reasons that I'll talk about over the course of the next few slides. Copyright duration also depends on the type of work. So, for example, photographs have very different copyright to letters, for instance, and also newspapers. So, yeah, actually the type of work is very important. Whether it is an orphan work or not, an orphan work we will talk about over the next few months in detail, I would imagine, and this is material where the creator is unknown. I'm sure that you will have many orphan works in your collection. It's been estimated that there are several million orphan works in heritage organisations in the UK. The copyright duration also depends on when the work was created or first published, when it was first made available to the public, or whether the work is Crown or government owned, because Crown copyright, again, is different to other types of copyright. Right, so I've given you an overview of some of the outline of some of the works, or most of the works, which are governed by copyright in the UK. So now, copying of your works in your collection are copying, making a photocopy, scanning, or even photographing your material. Now, this is actually what we call a restricted act. If your material is in copyright, and if the copyright is held by a third party, so this means you don't hold the copyright yourself, but somebody else holds the copyright. So, for example, the author of a letter, for instance, or the author of a newspaper article. So this is really where we start to find issues with managing in copyright works within our collections. So yeah, so simply, you know, photographing our works, or scanning them and putting them on to the website. So if you are not the copyright owner for that material, then you need to actually think about another way that you can actually display this material. Again, these choices are something that I'll talk about over the next few slides, and also in the next few sessions as well. Restricted acts also include distributing copies to users, so for example by email. Essentially, that is very much restricted if you do not own the copyright yourself. As I've already said, uses of images on websites and social media. Now, this is a big one. So social media is, I would say that the vast majority of material on Twitter, for instance, is not used correctly in terms of copyright. Most of the material on there will be in copyright, and most individuals on Twitter will not actually have the correct permissions to actually post this material onto their social media platform. I'm not saying that that is the case with heritage organisations and archives. I'm absolutely sure it's not. But just in terms of people and their individual and private accounts. So social media is a huge issue, well, as are websites as well, because these also impact on online catalogues as well. So other restricted acts relating to copying include the performing, playing or showing of a work in the public for literary, dramatic or musical works, not including artworks. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. So obviously, if you are performing this material, that is also a restricted act if that material is in copyright and you don't hold the copyright. Broadcasting the work, we talked about that briefly in the previous slide, and also other activities such as loaning your material out. That can also be very, very tricky to manage if you do not own the copyright yourself. Now, thankfully, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there are numerous copyright exceptions in the UK, and this is essentially what the heritage sector rely on when they are essentially creating copies of their material. So I just point out that copyright law applies equally to digital material and physical material as well. But the copyright law becomes more and more tricky for us to manage as more and more of our material is accessible or available or is put online, for example, online catalogues and other types of online activities that organisations are undertaking at the moment. Now, copyright exceptions, of course, allow you to legitimately use third-party copyright. So this is the copyright that you don't own. It's owned by somebody else, the author of a letter, for instance, that you have in your collection, for specific purposes without the requirement to seek permission of the copyright owner. So there are exceptions that we can use. Most of these exceptions have conditions and are subject to a fair dealing assessment, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And these copyright exceptions in the UK apply regardless of the wishes of the copyright owner. Right, so again, this is a slide which is jam-packed full of information. So again, I'm not going to go into great detail about every one of these major exceptions because we would be here all day. But I just wanted to put these up just so you just get an initial overview of what type of activities we are permitted to carry out within our archives. Now, these are the copyright exceptions, and what we should be doing with our material, the material for which we don't own the copyright. What we should be doing if we want to use it, if we want to put it on the online catalogue, for example, use it online or use it as part of the blog, we should be thinking, now, which one of these headings, which one of these major exceptions can we actually put this activity under? So essentially, a lot of what you do with managing your material, particularly your digital material, is trying to work out which exception you can actually put that activity under. Now, some of these will be very familiar to all of you, I am sure. Fair dealing for non-commercial research or private study, so photocopying and scanning. We're all aware of that. We all work in archive services, so it's possible as long as you undertake this in a fair and justifiable way. Essentially, this, you don't want to, you wouldn't want to, for example, photocopy the entire collection of letters, hundreds of boxes, for a researcher as private study, because arguably this isn't very fair, but it would perhaps be acceptable to undertake scanning of this material, at least some of the material in a fair way. We also have fair dealing for criticism or review, quotation. So under this heading, this exception, you are permitted to reproduce material, reproduction of artworks, for example, in corporate plans, extracts of text into exhibition panels and books, and film clips into exhibition spaces, as long as they are sufficiently acknowledged. Now, again, different organisations deal with this in different ways. Some of them will be very risk adverse and will not want to even consider using this type of exception. What they, the alternative, as we will see going forward, is to identify the copyright owner and ask for permission to do things like to reproduce material for exhibition spaces. Now, this is material reproduced, of course, so this is when you would be using exhibition boards or pop-up banner stands, for instance, when you are actually reproducing the material. Now, the next heading, fair dealing for the purposes of current news reporting, as long as it's sufficient knowledge. No copying or distribution of press articles because a license is required for this. And no photographs either. So there is some leeway there for your current news reporting. We also, of course, have fair dealing for the purposes of illustration for instruction. And this is a kind of educational fair dealing. It needs to be non-commercial in purpose. It needs to be acknowledged, and the way that organisations use this, for example, this might be the reproduction of copyrighted works for exam questions or educational activities in museums or for in-house training. We also have fair dealing for caricature, parody or pastiche. So, for example, exhibition panels using artworks. Again, this isn't something I've got time to talk about now, but some organisations will use this copyright exception to enable them to use and reproduce material relating to parody and pastiche. Making works available on dedicated terminals for public or private research. Well, we're all familiar with this. I'm absolutely certain about that. In recent years, with the rise in digital, a lot of organisations are now, and museums are looking at, for example, touchscreens, using touchscreens under this exception, and also audio booths as well. Now, the next one, copying for preservation, is very key for us as archivists, of course, or replacement. This is, I'm sure, something which most organisations will have done at some point over the last few years. You can copy if it is for preserving your collection, as long as it's part of your permanent collection and it's not publicly accessible elsewhere. So your activities under this heading, for example, will be migration from reel-to-reel to digital format, because ostensibly you are preserving that material. So the copyright exception will almost certainly apply there. Again, these exceptions are not in no way black or white. It's up to you as an organisation to manage this risk. And there always will be a very, very small risk that the copyright holder will come forward. And we just need to be aware of that. And of course, copying for accessibility purposes for individuals who identify as disabled for their personal use. You can copy whole or part of a work as long as it's part of your permanent collection and not publicly available elsewhere. So this is obviously an exception which is used all the time, particularly in educational establishments, subtitled archival films, for example, colour adjustments of images for dyslexic users. Another exception is the incidental inclusion of a work, for example, a painting in the background of a photograph. And I know that many organisations, particularly organisations which have a lot of art collections, that's one of the ways they get around the issue of some of their photographs having incidental depictions of paintings or paintings in the background. And then lastly, there is the orphan works exception, which I didn't want to talk about today, but I put in anyway, because this is the orphan works exception is an absolutely huge topic. And also because of Brexit, there has over the last few months been a lot of, or at least some impact on the orphan works exception. So I don't want to confuse people too much at this point. Just be aware that does exist, and we will, all being well, come back to that at a later date in a later session. I know there's a lot to take in there if you're not familiar with the subject matter, but again, you know, it's not something that you need to you don't need to know every single bullet point. It's something that you can come back to when you start to think about your how you're going to manage your collection going forwards. So what are the key challenges to managing copyright then for archivists and individuals working in heritage organisations? Well, as we know, that we have a vast range of different types of materials in our collections, from objects to photographs. As I said before, millions of our items are orphan works, so we do not know who the copyright holder is. And as I've hinted at already, different types of archival material, published material, are subject to different copyright regulations. So untangling copyright lifetimes is very complex because many works have different categories of copyright embedded within them. So just very generally then, just to give you an overview of this, audiovisual material, of course, has multiple rights holders. Film copyright holders, for instance, are those who help to create the film, including the script writer, the producer, the composer, and the songwriter. So audiovisual material has a lot of different copyright holders in. So it's not just the case of finding one copyright holder or author or creator. You need to identify several. Photograph copyright is very complex and should be handled with care. Again, you know, I can do a whole session on photographic copyright because it's just so complicated, because the laws have changed over the last 100 years or so, which means that different photographs from different years are under different copyright banners. And unfortunately, that is the case, but we can go forward a little bit about how we can actually deal with this. And book copyright, of course, you know, although we're talking about archives, we do all have published works in our collection. So book copyright will include the text, which is a literary work, the cover, which is an artistic work and may also be a literary work as well, because the title may, if it's long enough, may actually be a literary work in itself. It will have photographs in it as well, and also perhaps artistic works, and also a typographical arrangement, and also perhaps a musical arrangement as well, if it's a book about music. So again, very, very complex. And as many of us are aware, unpublished letters, manuscripts, diaries have lengthy duration of copyright in certain items. So, for example, some of these, the copyright runs until the end of 2039, regardless of the age of the manuscript. So this is another issue, because we need to, if your manuscripts, if your material comes under this heading, then you need to work out a way of managing that material if you are not currently the copyright holder of that collection. So just really, this is a kind of kicking off point before I go on to my case study. So how should we manage copyright in our collections, in our archives, and in our organisations? Well, again, this is a very, very broad topic, but just really thinking about those of you particularly who are in a position where you're actually just starting to think about how some of this can be managed. So copyright is about making risk, about taking risks and making informed judgments. You're not expected to be a copyright law expert. Essentially, you need to be aware of copyright, and you need to be aware particularly that there are certain things really you need to do if your material is in copyright and you don't own the copyright. So there is something very, very straightforward that all organisations can really start off with, and of course, you know, we've got many organisations who already do this and have been doing this for decades. But just again, essentially so that we're on the same page here. Agreements are very, very important starting point. We need to ensure that the agreements that you have with freelancers and photographers who are working for you on a freelance basis, and also perhaps artists who are creating material for you, perhaps individuals who are creating educational materials for you. So these are essentially freelancers or perhaps partners that you're working with, external partners. So it's really important to have written agreements in place. And these need to be very clear about the fact that they assign copyright of the work that they have created to your organisation. So if you have an external photographer taking photographs for you, perhaps for an event, then it's very important that you get, if you possibly can, not only the ownership of the photographs assigned to your organisation, but also the assigning of the copyright as well. And that means that you can actually use those works in the ways that you want to. And if the photographer or freelancer or artist or external partner does not want to transfer the copyright, and that's fair enough, very often that is the case, it's really important to make sure that sufficient permissions to use that work are in place. So, for example, licenses for the reuse of work in the future, and I'll talk about that in just a moment when I look at how we manage this at the Imperial War Museum recently. It's also another key point is to implement a written deed of copyright assignment for volunteers and work placements. This will ensure that copyright is assigned to the organisation, because we need to remember, of course, that the work the volunteers carry out, they are actually the authors for that work, and it's important that they sign, or that you implement a deed of copyright assignment to ensure that volunteers' work belongs to your organisation rather than to them. So that means you will then be able to use that material in the way that you want to. And of course, you know, this is perhaps an obvious point for many, but it is really important that in terms of depositors, so individuals depositing material with your organisation, it's very important to make sure that, or at least ask for them to transfer both the copyright and the ownership of the material at the point of acquisition. Now, as I said, very often depositors don't want to transfer the copyright. That's fine. They can just transfer the ownership of the material, say, for example, a letter or a notebook or a sketch pad, perhaps. But it's very difficult for you to deal with that material if they don't assign the copyright to you. And it's very important, of course, to issue written depositor agreements to all donors. So this needs to be done, of course, like the agreements, this needs to be done in writing. It's very important that this happens. Now, I just want to very quickly go on to my case study, which I've put up some further resources and reading there. And I just very quickly want to go on to my second PowerPoint, which is the case study. And I'm going to talk very briefly for the next 6 or 7 minutes about the 1480 Now project, which I've been the lead archivist on. I was the lead archivist on for almost 3 years. I just want to talk very quickly about how we managed copyright in a very general sense, because I think it relates to some key points that I've been making over the last 45 minutes or so. So just very quickly then, I was archivist on the 1480 Now programme. This is the UK Arts programme for the First World War centenary, which ran between 2014 and 2018. it was inspired by the period 1914 to 18, and 1480 now works with arts and heritage partners across the UK to commission new pieces for 420 contemporary artists, musicians, filmmakers, designers, performers, etc. 1480 now commissioned 107 projects, which took place in more than 220 locations across the UK. Now, I'm sure some of these you will be familiar with. So, for example, one of our most successful projects was the Poppies. You'll probably be familiar with the Poppies from the Tower of London, or perhaps from your local, because of course the Poppies went on tour. So perhaps a local city or town where the Poppies went on tour. So, for example, top right on the screen, we have the Poppies on tour at Hereford. Bottom left, I think, is Imperial War Museum, where they ended their tour in December 2018. Other key projects included Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old, Danny Boyle's Pages of the Sea, where the artists took images and photographic images of soldiers who were killed during World War I, and they set them out here on the beach, and then the tide came in and washed the images away. And this was a very kind of high profile project, which was televised. And just talking generally, the impacts of the 1480 Now project were very vast. The project engaged millions of individuals, including 8 million young people, with the First World War. And experiencing a 1480 Now project demonstratively increased the sense of relevance of the First World War to the UK public. Right, so let's just think very broadly then about some of the copyright issues which we had to deal with and manage as part of this project. Actually, although the project has finished, there are still activities and events which are still ongoing at the Imperial War Museum. So the issue is that 1480 Now does not hold the copyright for much of the material in the archive, especially the photographs and the films. So this is a typical situation, of course. 1480 Now worked with many regional partners. So, for example, the National Theatre and theatres around the country, venues, for instance, museums, cathedrals. And they were responsible for commissioning regional photographers and filmmakers rather than 1480 Now themselves. Now, this became a very big issue for us as archivists archiving this material, because 1480 Now therefore does not hold the commissioning contracts for much of this material from the photographers and the filmmakers, which is obviously causes and is continuing to cause a lot of issues. I'll talk about those in just a moment. Now, some of the material, the photographs, the videos, for example, has been licensed for non-commercial use by the Imperial War Museum, for example, to go on the website and on social media, and to a very limited extent to go on the online catalogue. But we are still very limited in what we can actually do with that material because of the issue with the commissioning contracts. So again, this is really down to thinking about how you can actually manage particularly your heritage projects in a kind of more holistic way, really. So I'll just talk for a couple of minutes or so about, before we wrap up, about the We're Here Because We're Here project. This is one of the projects which was commissioned in partnership with the award-winning artist Jeremy Della. It was funded by the Art fund as well, this particular project. It also has a standalone microsite. I put the hyperlink in there. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that Jeremy Deller essentially conceived of this idea where volunteers dressed up as World War I soldiers to commemorate the Battle of the Somme, and they essentially were sent out into towns and cities to mingle amongst the populace and to hand out cards with their names on them. And so again, this was a highly successful project. And again, the photographers and the filmmakers were again independent. They were freelance. They were not employees of the museum. So again, there are issues, particularly with this type of material, about what we can actually do with it, because we don't have the copyright for much of it. There's lots of many copyright issues associated with this particular project. So let's have a look. This is our nicely archived digital collection here. As you can see, we have media responses, project history, legal and financial evaluation, and legacy. I put the folders up here. This is part of the digital archive. So as you can see here, we have under media, we have newspapers and magazines. This is not 1489 copyright, so we can't do much with that. Emails, particularly most emails are not 1489 copyright, because of course email copyright holders are third parties. Legal and financial is mainly 1489 copyright. Same with evaluation, but legacy is really the big issue for us. This is legacy, is the photographs and the videos, over 2,000. In fact, for this particular project, which are now in the Imperial War Museum archive, digital archive, but these are mainly not 1489 copyright. They're mainly external copyright, third-party copyright, which means that the organisation is very limited to what they can actually do with them. And some of them are not. There are very few which are actually available online at the moment through the online catalogue, even though we catalogue nearly 20,000 individual records at item level for this project. And just very quickly, before I finish up, this is also to show you, as part of this project, this is Jeremy Deller's sketchbook, his ideas, the initial ideas for We're Here Because We're Here. The sketchbook was digitised on site by the Imperial War Museum in 2019, and then it was returned to Jeremy Deller. But the copyright and ownership of the digital images are still under discussion with the artist. So several years later, of course, the museum has these copies, that they essentially digital copies. They have been scanned in a professional manner, but actually at the moment the museum can't really do very much with them because they don't have because Jeremy Deller has not transferred the third-party copyright to the museum, or certainly not last time I spoke to the museum about this. But as I said, this is still very much an ongoing project for the museum. And here, this is just another shot, one of these lovely high-res images of Jeremy Deller's sketchbook, which currently the museum can't do very much with because they don't have the right types of permission. Right, so that is the end of my case study, and also the end of my talk. Let me stop sharing. So I hope that you found that a useful introduction. As I said, I know that some of you are copyright experts, and some of you are very much starting out. So I hope that I've kind of hit the right type of level, as it were, for people. So Victoria, I don't know, are we going to have a look at some of the the questions in the chat. So.
Thank you, Ellie. I was just going to run the Mentimeter really quickly.
Oh, yeah.
I know we're running sort of short on time, but I'd appreciate it if everyone could take a few minutes. It's just a few questions. And then, there's been a few questions that have come through in the chat. So I think you've already unshared your screen, Ellie. So I'm just going to pop this up for everyone now. And hopefully you can all see this and have been able to log in. And if you haven't seen the website address and the code in the chat box, it should be up here on the screen. So if everyone could just log in and have a go. Okay. Right, so it looks like we've got a good mix here coming through. Lots of other. Okay. Oh, very interesting mix here. So I think that's allowed for most of you to pop a response, and so I'll just move on to the next slide, and you should still be able to enter information into that first one. So moving on to the next, if you could just include some words or phrases that might come to mind when you think of copyright and archives. Tricky. Complicated. Scary.
This is a good one. I haven't seen one of these before. It's very good.
Yes. Yeah, I can see here that the complexity and the trickiness and challenging bits are there for a lot of people. And hopefully this series will help turn that around a little bit. Okay, that's great. I'm just going to move on to the next slide since most of you should have had a chance to pop some words in there. So the next question, if you could just let us know what you gauge your level of knowledge in relation to copyright to be. Okay, most folks in the moderate or limited categories. Great. Okay, and we've just got a couple more questions here, well, a few more. If you can think about where, if anywhere, do you normally go for your copyright information and advice? We'd find that helpful to know. So a real mix here as well. Looks like a lot of people go online first. Okay, great. And then, if you could indicate here in relation to the following topics, what sort of levels of priority for further training related to copyright might appeal to you? And this will just help Ellie to prioritize and plan the future sessions so that they're as relevant as possible for everyone. So if you could just take a moment to think about that. Right. Brexit and copyright and community archives are coming up through a mix here. Okay, that's great. And we'll just move on to the next one. So if you can just pop any topics in there that we might not have covered in that slide, you know, that might be of interest to you. Maybe have covered everything. Okay. People produced work. Ah. Oh gosh, it's quite a bit here.
Mhm.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, this should actually be scrolling up so everyone can see it, but it doesn't seem to be doing that today. That's okay. I'll just give a couple more moments for anyone to enter anything further in here. Here we go. Looks like a lot there for you, Ellie, to, to think about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's good, really good though to have this,
great.
because it tells us a lot about what people are looking for.
Yes. Right. Thank you very much, everyone, for that. That is the end of the poll. So I'll just pass on to you, Ellie. I know we don't have much time here and technically we should be finished up by now, but if everyone's okay to maybe cover a couple of questions and then we can follow up with some of these. So there's one that's come through. Is there okay. How would an owner transfer copyright when they transfer ownership if it's generated automatically without registration? Would you just add it in to the contract for them to sign? This is a bit of a complex one that might be better followed up later.
Yeah, absolutely. This is probably something we can do as part of the training session of one of the sessions, and I can show you some example templates of that organisations use for the transfer of copyright. So really they need to indicate as part of that form that they are actually a copyright owner. So very often there's a box to tick that will say, I certify that I am the copyright owner for this material. And then there'll be another box to tick underneath which will say, I am now transferring this ownership over to the museum or the archives or whatever. So it's best to be as specific as possible with this material. And there are many examples out there of these templates that you can use, but that's certainly something that we can touch on or look at in future sessions about how this, having a look at templates and how different organisations deal with this. But it's really important in the 21st century to get this cleared up, because so many organisations are in the position, still that they have, items in their collection that they don't even know where they came from. They don't even know what the provenance is because it hasn't been recorded, and they certainly don't know the copyright. But it just makes for a lot of work further down the line if anybody wants to then use or reuse those works. So yeah, essentially it is a very kind of complex area, but hopefully doing what I've said in relation to the copyright agreement is will be helpful to you.
Oh, thank you, Ellie. That's great. And I think you maybe touched on another question here is that are there a suite of example documents for use by small organizations available from anywhere? And is that something that that you would be aware of, that you would be happy to share with people?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to share very quickly the further resources in reading slide. These are, I've put here some websites and publications. So in terms of smaller organisations, if you haven't already, I would recommend having a look at the second under the websites, which is the Heritage Digital Resources. So Heritage Digital is a National Lottery Heritage Fund project on which I have I've done a little bit of work, and there is they have a fantastic selection of online training resources and also templates and documents which relate to all sorts of areas, but including intellectual property right and copyright as well. And they've been working in partnership with Naomi Korn Associates. So much of the material that they have developed for Heritage Digital has actually been developed by Naomi Korn. And there's all sorts of resources, and including videos and training, online training sessions. So it's absolutely invaluable, and Heritage Digital is about upskilling the sector, and it's very much aimed at smaller organisations and community archives as well. So have a look at that. Again, that's all free, it's all open source. And also have a look at Naomi Korn Associates resources page. That's absolutely invaluable. There's all sorts of guidance there. There are all sorts of templates that you can use. I can't remember exactly which templates. I would have to go back and have a look because I haven't looked at it for a while. Templates, again, links to online training sessions. And again, this is all open source. It's all free for you to download. And of course, if you have, if you're a smaller organisation that has any kind of budget or training budget, then do attend one of Naomi Korn's training sessions on copyright. They are obviously, you would have to pay a small fee for that, but it really is worthwhile because she can give you some much more kind of individual and personal attention. There are smaller sessions with fewer attendees, and she'll be able to talk to you a little bit about your organisation as well. So I really recommend having a look at what she provides in terms of the online training as well. I would also suggest having a look at this book, which is absolutely brilliant. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this. So sorry, I'm trying to share my screen and show you. This is also on the slide. This is again very much for an introduction to the heritage sector. This is Naomi Korn and Gordon McKenna's Copyright Practical Guide, published by the Collections Trust. And this is not available on Amazon, I have to say, but you can get it directly from the Collections Trust website. So I put the hyperlink in there. And again, that's very much aimed at smaller organisations and people just starting out. Absolutely an absolute godsend. And it's only, I think it was about £18 or perhaps even less. And then for people, obviously people wanting to, with a bit more knowledge, of course, there's two recent books, including Naomi Korn, Oppenheim and Muir's Information Law, which was published last year. So that's up to date, almost up to date. It doesn't include Brexit, really, obviously, for obvious reasons. And also, of course, Tim Padfield's Copyright for Archivists and Records Managers, which was published in 2019, so the year before. But again, the last two, the books are aimed at kind of, obviously professionals working in the sector and are quite complex. So lots of resources there for people starting out, and also the website at the top, copyrightuser.org, is also incredibly useful and a recognised academic source, as it were, for copyright. But as the sessions go on, I'll make sure that I provide you with a further resources and meaning for each session, so that you can follow up in that particular area if you have the time or the need. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Ellie. And I'm mindful of time here for everyone, but and that there's many more questions, but we will compile these along with the feedback from the poll, and and try and see if they can be addressed or covered. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. Thank you very much, Ellie. I think everyone's found this really useful, and we'll be happy to to share the slides, yeah, and the recording with everyone afterwards. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.